Part 1. Order. Now, why do we begin here? You might say, bro, why do I need order? I'm an artist, not an accountant, okay? I'm a creative person. I live in chaos. Always have, always will. I just want to have fun making music. I'm not interested in any restrictions of any sort. Leave me alone with order. I want to be free. And fair enough, it is tedious and not fun at all to organize your projects, label every single clip and make regular backups. All of that is a huge pain in the ass, I get it. But that being said, what do you think is worse? Having to brush your teeth twice a day or walking around with a rotten fucking mouth? Hygiene is fundamental, not only when it comes to your teeth. So no matter what your goals are as a producer, some producers want different things depending on your personality. Some want to develop their skills so they can express themselves. So that would be the artist types. You know, they want to develop their own style and have fun with it. Some of you want to become good at production in general, so they can become useful in the market, which is also fine. For some, it's an escape. And again, for some, it's, they want recognition or something like that, which is fine. I'm not judging any of these motivations. All of those different producer types have something in common, whether they know it or not, whether they're conscious of it or not. What they want is to get into the state of flow. What is this flow state? Some call it being in the zone, some call it flow, some call it being on fire. No matter what you call it, this is the zone you enter when your environment and you become one. You lose your sense of self, you lose sense of time, and everything just flows effortlessly. Time goes by and the song writes itself, basically. You can experience the same thing with any activity you're fully engaged in. So for example, when you're in the midst of a movie or a video game or a meaningful conversation. And the reason why everyone wants to be in that state is that everything they want on the surface is a byproduct of the flow state. So for the guy who wants to escape, this is the vehicle to do this, because once you lose your sense of self and sense of time, you literally escape your everyday life. And for the guy who just wants to release music regularly, this is the way to go. You know, the more time you spend in flow, the more music gets done, the more you release, the more money you get. And for those of you who want to develop their own style, this is essential, because you can only develop your own unique style when you're in this intimate state of flow, because this is where you're mostly in touch with yourself, although you're not really feeling yourself, if it makes sense. It's a strange thing, this flow state, but that's what it is. Now, how do you get into flow? Here's a schematic diagram of what flow looks like. The horizontal axis represents the person's skill level, and the vertical axis represents the difficulty of a given task. Now, according to this model, you will get into a flow state when your skill level matches the difficulty of the task. That's when you're most engaged. Now, what happens if your skill level exceeds the challenge? You get bored. What happens if the challenge is too difficult? You get overwhelmed and anxious. But if you balance those two, you get into flow. Okay. Now I'd like to present a variant of this diagram. It's still the same concept, but instead of skill level, we say that's order, or what you know, the known. And instead of challenge, we say that's the unknown, or symbolically speaking, that's chaos. Now you can read this diagram as follows. Flow happens when the forces of order and chaos are balanced. So if you're spending too much time with what you already know, there's no novelty, and therefore you get bored. And on the other hand, if you're confronted with too much of what you don't know, you're in chaos. You're overwhelmed, anxiety kicks in, game over. Right here is the answer to the question, why can't we finish projects? Because it's complex, it's overwhelming, we're right here in anxiety mode, okay? Now by simply reading this diagram, you can find the solution to the problem. So what can you do to tilt this anxiety thing towards flow? We introduce order. That's it. Order is a fundamental part of flow. This is why order is important on a macro level. It is the counterbalance to the chaos that you're surrounded by. So in order to unlock your creative potential, you need to have one foot in order and one foot in chaos. You need to stand stable in both of these areas. So too much chaos isn't good for obvious reasons. You're overwhelmed, but too much order isn't good either, because there's no excitement in it. So if you're constantly spending time in anxiety zone, guess what? You won't have the confidence to try new things. You will stick to what you know instead of diving into uncharted territory. You're not confident to make big steps, which means you're moving more timidly. But in order to build something meaningful, you have to make bold moves, you know, and you can't get into flow with such a slow pace. So you got to make big steps like a big boy, all right? Order is what grounds you and enables you to confront the unknown and return with something valuable. And it provides you with a certain level of stability, so you're courageous enough to expose yourself voluntarily to the unknown. I know it's counterintuitive at first, but from personal experience, when you execute on this, the results will speak for themselves. Okay, I think that's enough theory for now. Let me show you how you can apply this in a practical way. Because all of this might sound intangible at first, but it is very practical actually. Just look at what I'm doing right now. The only reason I'm able to do this complete breakdown of a track that I did like 5 years ago is because I know exactly where the final version of the project file was, and I can open it up, it loads up perfectly, and I know exactly where which element is without even looking it up, because it's embedded within my system. And it's not even that great of a system or anything. It's not like I have the best system in the world or something. The point is that I'm consistent with it. That is the punchline. So no matter what system you end up using, make sure to stick with it. So you don't have to adopt my way, but I'm gonna walk you through it, of course, and you can use whatever makes sense to you. But just stick with one system over the years and you will see the results. Okay, I'm gonna start with my basic structure. Okay, let's start with my folder structure. As you can see, there's not a whole lot going on here. I have basically 2 folders where everything is taking place. The first being the sample library, which I will get into in a second, and the projects folder. Within this projects folder, there are different stages of a project, starting with the draft stage, which is a folder that contains unfinished ideas. I'm sure everyone has a folder just like this one where you started a beat or something, but you're not really committed to finishing it yet. So that's where that goes. As you can see, there is a 0 behind, or a double 0 behind every one of these FLPs. And this is how I do my version control. So version number 0 means this song is still in its potential phase. It may become a song at some point, it may not be. So this is an indicator of the stage of the song, so I know exactly where I am. And there's basically 2 destinations for a project file like this. Either I'm getting serious about it and I'm gonna finish it, then it moves up in my hierarchy and it gets its own folder with its own system. Or I will do nothing with it and it ends up in a what I like to call graveyard, which is just a folder with unfinished ideas of that year. And if I haven't deleted the file by then, it means that there's probably something in it and I may use for in another project. So there is a chord progression or something, or a groove, something that I can use for another project. So there are cases where I have resurrected something from the dead, but that's definitely not the norm. Okay, so when I get serious about a song and I want to finish and release it, it gets its own project folder. And all my project folders look the same, exactly the same. They have the same structure with 4 subfolders. The first one is the versions folder, which contains all the project files from version 1 to the final version. The prints folder, which contains audio prints of each of those versions. So after every session, once I finish a session, I export the audio file of that current state. So I know where exactly I am within the project, and that's what I use to then start the next session with. It's like a documentation type of thing. And then I have the bounced folder, which contains audio bounces and samples that I need for this project, which also can contain MIDI files or patches or presets, effects chains, stuff like that. Some people call it frozen files, some call them baked files. I call them audio bounces, and that's why the folder is called bounced. And lastly, we have the stems folder, which contains the audio group stems of the final version, which I then use to mix and master the final version with. Okay, and then once a project is done, it moves up into the finished projects folder, which is literally just my archive of finished tracks that I did this year. Okay, that's it for my folder structure, I guess. It's pretty simple, and the reason for that being that FL Studio's content management system sucks. So whenever you move a file, most likely FL Studio won't be able to find it, so you have to search for it manually. So that way there's only 2 places where a file can hide once I lose it. So that's pretty convenient. All right, let's get to my sample library. Okay, so here we are in FL Studio, as you can see, and here on the side is the structure of my library, which I won't get into much detail now because it's actually more important to talk about how I came to the structure in the first place, not exactly the details of the structure. So let's rewind a couple of years back before I had any idea of how to manage or structure anything. So I just had literally one folder called samples, and it contained all the samples that I owned. So in there was random drum kits and sample packs and acapellas and presets and patches and everything just in one place. So needless to say, it was a big mess, and I ran into trouble constantly because, as I mentioned before, FL Studio's content management system is kind of useless. So whenever I would move a file in my, I wouldn't say library, but in this huge folder, FL Studio wouldn't be able to find the file once I rebooted the project file. So I had to search for it manually, and sometimes that took forever, or I didn't find the file at all. So I needed to put an end to this misery. So I decided to put a structure to my sample library, essentially. But I didn't have any idea of how to structure my samples because I didn't know what samples I actually owned. So I had a huge collection of samples, but I didn't actually know half of what I owned. You know, I just downloaded packs and packs and packs and didn't even realize that I had so many samples that I would never even consider using. So back to the point of, you know, chaos and order and known and the unknown, I literally had no idea what I owned, so I couldn't make a structure out of it. So the way I would go about it was I would literally go through every single sample that I owned and make a call on whether or not to keep it. So the way I would do it is literally listen to a kick and then imagine myself using this in any context. And if I couldn't imagine me using this kick in a context, then I would delete it. So there was a lot of kicks with too much processing on them and reverb and stuff like that, so I would just kick those samples anyway because I couldn't clean them up, so I would never use them in the field. Right, so that was the way I did it, and I did it in multiple passes. I think I listened to every single sample that I owned 4 times, which took about 3 weeks to a month. But then the structure kind of manifested itself out from the knowledge of whatever I was owning, right? So the categories for that you see here kind of manifested themselves as I was going through each and every one of those samples. So I knew I had kicks, I had different snares and claps and cymbals, so that was the categories that I knew that I had to make. So it doesn't make sense to think of a structure and then put your samples on it. So the structure will depend on the samples you own, okay, if that makes sense. So don't just copy my system or whatever, but actually listen to the samples that you have and then build a structure around it. That's what I would do. And the good thing about this listening through everything is, first of all, you only keep things that you personally like, which is a really subjective thing, which is important to developing your own style, because by definition you only keep the samples that you personally like. And second of all, the quality of your sample library increases because you only keep samples that you actually like or are likely to use. So these are 2 pluses that you get on top of a structure that you actually can use to find a sample that you're looking for. So that is how I would go about structuring my sample library if I had to redo it again. And you can do it as differentiated or granular as you want. Mine is pretty rough actually. So if I look at this, I have a drums folder. Within this drums folder I only have 6 other categories, and if I go to the cymbals, for example, there's only 7 more categories, and that's it. I don't go more granular than that. You can go nuts if you want, but in my mind, the more complex your library is, the more likely you can get lost in your own library, which really isn't the point of a library. You want to make it as general as possible and as complex as necessary. I think that's a rule of thumb that you can apply. Okay, I think that's it for the sample library. Okay, the next thing we need to talk about is color mapping. Color mapping means you're using the same colors for the same elements across all your projects. So for example, I have these 7 colors that I use for every single project, and I use them for the same elements in every project as well. So turquoise is always my kick, and it's always the first element in the track. It's always in the same spot, so I don't have to look for it. For example, I haven't opened this file for a couple of years, and I still know where everything is because my structure is always the same, and the color mapping is mapped accordingly. So first element is my kick, it's always turquoise, followed by my drums, which are always orange. Yeah, and then I have, fuck. Dude, I know, I remembered turquoise, but I didn't remember the name for orange. Dude, what the fuck? Anyway, then followed by my sub bass. Then I got my synths. Then yellow is miscellaneous stuff and lead sounds. In this case, it's the guitars here in this project. Then I have the vocals, not always, but for the tracks that have vocals in them, vocals come after the lead. And lastly, we have the effects. And that's the structure that I always use. As you can see, it corresponds with the mixer as well. So the first element is the kick, and the second the drums, and so forth. So there's no confusion there. And the reason why I put the drums in one group separated from the kick, and the reason why I split it like this in 7 groups, I will get into those details in the mixing and mastering episode. But for now, you just need to know that these are the groups that I will bounce as stems, and then I will mix and master with those. Okay, so the color isn't really that important, you know, it's pretty arbitrary. One day I just decided to make the drums orange, and then I just stuck with it for the rest of time, right? So it doesn't matter what the color is. The important thing is to keep consistent with the color. So my kick is always turquoise, and that's the rule. Okay, it's pretty basic, but that's how I do my color mapping. What else? Is there anything else I can say about color mapping? Yeah, the individual colors can vary, of course. So this clap right here is whatever this is, Bordeaux or brown. What is this? Purple. But it doesn't matter. Like, these colors don't matter as much. I like to think in groups instead. And yeah, one important thing always also to mention is I don't do this right at the beginning, because this takes a lot of time. This routing and everything, and this coloring and stuff takes a lot of time. It's a huge pain in the ass, and it usually is the least fun part of the project to do. So I don't do it after every session or even that regularly. There's a place and time for chaos, and there's place and time for order. I know I've been beating the drum of order for a couple of minutes now, and it is really important, but chaos is important as well, especially the creative chaos. And usually a project also starts out as pretty chaotic, you know, because you just throw in a sample here and there, and then you kind of make it work, and it doesn't really matter what the structure is by that point. And my projects look really, really messy up to version 3 or 4 or something. But once I'm committed to finishing this, and I know that I have something here that will probably sound good once it's done, then I'm also motivated enough to do this extra step of cleaning everything up. So I don't do it every time, but once you do it once, so you have one session where you clean everything up, you plug everything into its respective effects channel, and you route everything and you group everything together so it also goes nicely in here. Then it sort of sorts by itself, and you don't need to order everything every time, but it's important to have one major cleanup session once you're committed to finishing the song. That's my rule of thumb. The more you do it, the easier it becomes, of course, but yeah, I only would do it as much as necessary. Don't overdo it with the order, unless it's fun to you, but I don't think so. Yeah, what else? I think I will explain my template when I get to the mixing part. You can also download this. I will put a link in the description for my mixer template. It's very basic. It's just a couple of groups which then go into sends, which I don't use as send channels, but actually as stem channels, as group channels. And yeah, that's it for color mapping. One last note on organization before I go is name your shit properly. What I mean by properly is, first of all, make it specific so you know exactly what it is. Make sure to put as much information in that label as you need. And secondly, keep it consistent, especially throughout your music projects, because the last thing you want to do is to learn a new system every time you start a new song, right? So what I would advise is to come up with a very simple system that a fucking monkey could understand, and then use that in perpetuity. So for example, we have a couple of automation clips here, and it's a little hard to keep them apart sometimes, especially when they all look similar like that. So what I like to do is to both name the clip itself and label the track they're in as well. Because if I have a situation like this where I can't even read the label unless I'm zooming in, it's really good to have it appear here in the track as well. So this, for example, is a volume automation. This is something that I do all the time, so that's why I abbreviated volume with VOL. And I do that for most of the things that I do all the time. Like this is a high pass filter automation, and this is a low pass filter automation. So I abbreviated them with HP and LP respectively for high pass filter and low pass filter. This is a system that works pretty well for me. I open up a project that I haven't looked at for a while, and I just look for these abbreviations and the color mapping, and I know exactly that this is a low pass filter automation for the clap, and the clap is here. So this is the way I like to do it. The consistency of naming your files also applies to your project files as well. So I always want to know which track I'm working on and which version I'm in. And also sometimes I want to put in the title if I did any major changes. So for example, I'm trying different experiments for the second drop. So sometimes there's a genre switch or a tempo switch or something like that. Something that I'm not sure it will work yet. So I do different paths or different routes of that track. And that way I can see in the title without opening it which version it is. And I also do these prints at the end of every session, like I mentioned before, so I don't actually have to reload the huge project files, and I can just go into the prints folder and see how these different versions are different from one another. And the same applies also for exported files. Like for example, we have a couple of drum loops here, and what I like to do is to put as much information into them as possible for two reasons, really. The first reason is, if it's really specific, sometimes I don't even have to open or play the file to know what it is. So for example, this is a 105 BPM drum loop of my track Let You Down. And the second reason is FL Studio's content management system, as I mentioned before, is pretty bad. So if I'm bouncing stems, for example, and I don't specify the names, so it's just a drum stem, for example, and I do that for 5 projects, for example. So I have the file called drum stem like 5 times on my hard drive. Sometimes what FL Studio does is it just randomly replaces a drum loop with another drum loop because it thinks it's the same file because of the name. So you gotta really pay attention to that and make the file name unique, because then you won't run into problems like that. Okay, so the whole file naming thing isn't something that I do as I go most of the time, because it's, it ruins the flow of working, because I just want to make the automation and then move on and listen to it. So what I do is I separate those sessions. I have my creative sessions, the chaos sessions, if you will, and I have my order sessions where I, label my stuff and do the color mapping and delete stuff that I don't need, and all of that jazz. Because if I try to do it all at once, I kind of get confused and chaotic, and then I don't get either done. Then I'm not creating, and I'm not really tidying up either. So it's really important to do different sessions. And I do these cleaning up sessions, especially when I don't have much time. So for example, if it's late or something and I know I'm gonna go to sleep in an hour or two anyway, so I might just you know, use that time, clean up a little bit. So I rather do that than start a new session and then, you know, get all creative and stuff. Because for me, it's also easier to get into this creative flow when I know that I have unlimited time on the back end. So that's one thing to keep in mind. What else? Yeah, I think if questions come up, you can always ask if something was unclear. I was kind of rushing through all of these topics because I could talk about this forever, basically. I barely touched upon any of these topics. So if you have any questions to specifics of any of this, let me know in the comments. Otherwise, we will see each other in the next part when we talk about context and contrast. All right, see you guys next time. Bye.